Hello, everybody. We're ready to begin. Thank you for joining us for another Transformative Teachers webinar. We're joined today by Maria Houston, Mullen. Hello, Maria. How are you?
Hi, I'm good, thank you.
Great. So before we begin, we have a little bit of housekeeping. The first thing to tell you is that you can watch these recordings again. Here's the link. The website is the same page that you went to in order to register for this webinar. So it's very easy to find new webinars, upcoming ones and the previous ones all in one place. We will put this link up again on the slide at the end of the webinar. So don't worry, you'll have a chance to see it again. Your screen view, you should be able to see myself and Maria and the slides. Your video and microphone are off because there's too many of you to have those on, but you can message everybody via the chat box and the Q&A box. So the chat box is for general comments, sharing your experiences, etc. And the Q&A box is any questions that you would like Maria or myself to answer. So as we go through any questions you have, please put them in the Q&A box and we will try to address them as we go through the talk today, if we can. One more important thing is that in the chat drop-down box, you've got two options. You've got everyone and hosts and panelists. I don't know why some defaults are set to one or the other, but make sure that you've chosen everyone if you want your messages to go to all attendees. So in the Q&A box, select everyone from the drop-down. So let's check that this is all working for everybody. So in the chat box, could you please type into the chat box your favorite way to say hello in your language, whether it's the equivalent of hello, hi, hey, hiya, whatever it may be. Let's see what we've got and where people are in the world. Wow, they're coming fast. Hey there. Bonjour. Hola. Lovely. Fantastic. Okay. All right, everybody. First, one more thing to mention before we begin is that we don't have certificates of attendance for these webinars because these webinars aren't training as such. We're not training in relation to Trinity. This is just a sharing of best practice. It's a community. It's like joining the Transformative Teachers Facebook page and just sharing your ideas. But I'm sure that you will find today's webinar extremely valuable. So I shall introduce Maria now. So Maria has taught in EFL for 22 years. She's been a Trinity examiner for 14 years. She's lived and worked all around the world. She's got a story from every place she's been to. She's taught all kinds of student courses, whether it's beginners, advanced, teacher training, and she's currently teaching various academic English courses, both online and face-to-face. So Maria brings with her a wealth of knowledge and experience today. So without further ado, Maria, I will stop sharing and I will hand over to you.
Okay, good stuff. Thanks, Lucy. So hello, everybody. I hope you find this webinar really useful today. So let me share my screen. Can everybody see that? Can you see that, Lucy?
Yes, yes.
Okay, lovely. So today we're looking at breaking down the academic writing process, which really is a process. So today, what I'm going to hopefully get through is looking at how we break down the essay question, so using a formula PQRS, how students can include a position in academic writing, synthesizing sources, critically evaluating sources, and using academic tone. So firstly, let's look at finding your voice in academic writing. Just move that over here. Sorry, it's blocking. I can't. There we go. So what defines the Anglo-Saxon geolinguistic context that we're working in here in the UK? Because everywhere, especially teaching international students, I found, one of their main struggles is how do they write, an academic essay in a British university? What's the style? What are the conventions? Because often it varies across the world, really. So in this context, the burden of clarity is on the reader. And what's your responsibility as a writer? If you write something and it's unclear to the reader, it's your responsibility to go back and fix it so the reader is informed and understands.
Maria, have you found that students find it quite difficult to get their heads around this?
Absolutely, absolutely. I sometimes find with some of my students that, it's often, their essays often go off in different tangents, which is kind of acceptable in some contexts. But here in the UK, it's really important that an essay is clear and concise, and that you develop a position at the beginning of your essay in your introduction, and that's your thesis. That's really important. It's also really important that you use evidence, so any data or statistics, and then obviously, evaluate that evidence, link it together, comment on it, and sort of have that voice throughout your essay. And lots of explanation, the structure of your paragraphs, etc. So yes, it's quite complex. So I think it's really important, wherever you are in the world, that students are aware of the conventions of where you are. What are the rules? There often aren't loads of rules, but mainly what are the conventions, and what's expected of them, and ask their teacher, to find out what's expected of them, but to have that conversation, because often students just launch in and start writing in their own style, and that's just not, that doesn't always work.
I think they can assume that their main focus is learning to write with English, the correct vocabulary and grammar for an academic essay, without realizing that there could be an incredibly different style that they actually need to learn, which is possibly more important than having.
Absolutely, and that's the process, that takes a long time, but getting them to notice it very early on and sort of, going back to it, through the course, that raises awareness, and I think that's really useful. And then once they go into university and start their undergraduate, they'll develop that as they go and become much more confident. So I've got I've put a reference list at the end of these slides, but there's a really useful video that I found talking about finding your voice in academic writing. So I've put the name there and the title. Okay, so let's just look at the start of the sort of academic writing process. So looking at the question and breaking that question down. So often students, have a look at a question and they just launch straight into writing. And often they don't answer the question. So spending time on breaking down your essay question is really beneficial, and it allows you to focus on what the question's asking you to do. So I'm looking at.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to address something right now, because I see that a couple of questions have come up in the Q&A, which are asking about word limits, but we're not talking about Trinity exam writing today. This isn't about Trinity exams. This is just Trinity hosting. These transformative webinars aren't related to the Trinity exams. It's just a free resource that Trinity provides on all kinds of topics. So Maria is talking about the academic writing process for students who are going to university or who are already at university. So it's not linked to a particular exam. So I think, of course, there are word limits at university, but I don't know if we might come back to that later on.
I think this could also be useful for, people potentially doing other kind of exams, but just understanding if they were going to come to the UK and study, you know, maybe you could.
Yeah, and of course a good exam does reflect the skills that they're going to be using at university. So I think that when they're preparing for an exam, then they are preparing for university if that exam is well designed. But if we're talking about particular tasks in exams, then we won't be covering that. But yeah.
All right.
Sorry, Maria, go ahead.
That's all right. So we're looking at a formula called PQRS. So P is for parts. So looking at the essay question and breaking it down into parts. And often questions have 2 or more parts. My experience of using this formula has been really good in terms of getting the student to focus on answering the question, doing what the question's asking you to do. This parts often causes a bit of confusion. So I don't want you to, if you do intend to use this, I don't want you to get too sort of caught up on that, because the rest of it's really useful. But even so, having said that, it's still useful for them to have a look and see if they can break down their essay question into parts. Q is for question words. And so, as we all know, question words require you to do lots of different things. So it's really important that students can identify that and then can think about what that means and what they need to do. R is looking at relevant words, so looking at what the topic is. So when they start their research, they're looking at the right topic, and also key words. So sometimes students might miss that. And then when they do produce a piece of writing, they haven't really answered the question, so task achievement's not fulfilled. And finally, structure. So just getting students to think about, at this stage, the very initial stage, of how what their essay might look like. You know, how would they organize it? I mean, you wouldn't want too much detail here, but at least to start thinking about it. Okay, so I just, Lucy.
So you're just setting them in the right path to begin with, so that they don't go off in the wrong direction and end up with a very well written essay that doesn't answer the question.
Yeah, and I often spend quite a bit of time on this, you know, because what comes after this is then the research. So that's the reading, you know, because obviously in academic writing, you need evidence, you need support, you need to find sources. So that's what comes next here. So really important to give your students time to break down their essay question and think about it and check in with you to see if they're on the right track, etc. So I've just got an example of what those might look like. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of time. This is where it gets stuck. Yeah, okay, lovely. So here's the essay question. Just take a moment to have a read of that. Okay. So in terms of parts, I've highlighted 2 parts. There's almost 2 jobs that they've got to cover, 2 things they've got to do. The question words are identify and discuss. So I'd spend a little bit of time with students on understanding what that means. So what is it asking you to do? Topic is childhood obesity. And then main causes, increase, developing countries, socioeconomic, health effects are the key words, really important for them to stay focused on the question. And obviously when it comes to starting their research and looking for sources, these are the key words they would use in their searches, you know, to make sure their sources are relevant to their question.
There's a question that's come up here, Maria. How do we teach our learners they need to answer both questions and it's not a choice?
I suppose they're asking you to do 2 different things. So then you would I suppose you'd look at the structure of the essay then and make sure you'd include, make sure that they covered those two things in the main body. You know, let me just go.
So that's why it's really good to look at that structure right at the beginning, because it helps them to check whether they have identified the parts and the keywords.
Yeah. And often there'll be a question in there, you know, do the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, for example? That might be in there as well, attached to something else. And then that needs to be, you know, part of their position. They need to answer that in the introduction. And once they've done that, and then they, you know, and that will, determine the structure of their essay as well.
Mm-hmm.
But like I say, you'd spend time on this in the classroom. Okay, Lucy, so this is just very brief, this structure. I mean, you could break it down into much more detail, but this is just to give you a sort of understanding of what that might look like. Okay, so that was quite brief, but now I'm moving on to developing a position in academic writing, and how do you do that? So how do you develop a position in academic writing? So I'm waiting for some questions or answers, sorry, to fly up.
So would you like people to put in the chat box any ideas they have?
Yeah, what do they think? And I'm sure there's people there that are teaching higher level.
Yeah, well, there's quite a lot of comments in the chat as well about various different exams and how these things relate to that, Maria. So I think this is very useful, but it's a tricky question, isn't it? How do you develop a position or a... In
academic writing, I think that's really important.
So what have we got? Oh, good things. So we've got setting the tone.
Okay,
ask students to give their initial short responses, as if someone just asked them the question on the street. Yeah, I do that kind of thing a lot too. I think that's good, to just be really concise. Read widely. Well, we've talked about that a few days ago, didn't we, Maria? The importance of reading widely.
Yeah,
start with your gut instinct. These are great. Make a stand.
Yeah, and all of that really, starting with your gut instinct and making a stance, and
conduct research. We talked about that as well, didn't we? That students sometimes think they need this position, and then they find the research that fits that. But really, if you're conducting the research and collecting evidence, as Carolina here says, then that's so
I think initially it's really important to think about your thoughts on the question. It's really important to think about that. But in my experience, and I think what's sort of, because in British universities, academic writing and your position and voice is determined by the sources that you're using, and being able to sort of look at different theories and link them together. And by doing all that research, students may have a position at the beginning, but once they start their research, because that's what comes next, and then they'll start forming their position once they're looking at sources and theories, and think about how that relates to their question and how they would use it. So I think a position in academic writing really does rely on your sources, and what angle you're going to take, and what view your sources are taking too, and how convincing your sources are.
I think students can be afraid of changing their mind, can't they? That they think they need to start with a position, stick with it, but actually changing your mind is hopefully part of the purpose of doing academic study.
Absolutely. But I think that's really important as well, in terms of talking about your position, just stressing to students how important it is to do research, to find sources that are relevant to your question. Okay, so looking at having a position in academic writing, there's lots of different ways of doing that, and obviously you need to show your position throughout your essay. Your essay has to support that. So I've just put together some ways that students can do that. So sort of breaking it down a little bit of what you can focus on in the classroom. And this isn't going to be one lesson. I mean, this is going to be over a period of time, over a course, that you would sort of introduce this in. So if we have a look at the first one. So we're basing this on using academic sources. So thinking about how confident you are in the validity of claims that you're using, we look at using cautious language, and especially in sort of UK universities, cautious language, that's what you find often in essays, academic writing. So language like possibly or perhaps, maybe, might, could. You could also make your own position known by adding a critical comment. So thinking about the strengths of the source you've used or the theory that you're using or its weaknesses and making a comment on that. Integrating sources in your voice. So this can show your stance and help build your argument. So by using reporting verbs. So often reporting verbs can express agreement or disagreement, or they can be neutral. So depending on what reporting verbs you're using, the reader will be able to, understand your view and your claims and what you think. Sorry, I couldn't change this yellow, but showing your position by commenting on the strengths of links between sources. So you could use a range of evaluative adjectives and adverbs that highlight your opinion. So rightly, wrongly, misguided. And then finally, if you've got a higher level of confidence, you can convey that by using intensifying words like clearly, definitely, most likely. So you would sort of combine all of this together in a piece of writing, and this is your voice basically in your essay. This is a way of doing it.
So I think students often focus on learning a collection of verbs and adjectives and language they can use, but don't maybe think so deeply about the meaning of it. They just sometimes I find students think that words are interchangeable, that you just need to pepper your writing with a range of words. But I suppose what you're saying here is that carefully selecting which word you want to use can show this position, and so they need to be very aware of that and choose carefully.
Absolutely. And there's some really useful exercises, on the internet. I've put a link in at the end, where you can use reporting verbs and their meaning in a classroom lesson, or intensifying words, things like that. There's lots of sources out there.
Great.
Anything else, Lucy, on that you
There's a Q&A question here. It's not maybe directly relevant to this slide, but I think it's a great question. So some learners struggle with different conventions, such as, do I include an abstract? Do I use US spellings? How do I know the subtle differences from standard English? Which referencing style, whether it's Harvard or another one? What's your advice on the UK university conventions?
Well, I think it's up to the student to find out what referencing system they're using at the university. Your tutors will tell you that.
And on their course, because you can find
that their course, it will tell you
they vary.
That. And then most university websites, have the referencing guide, so it will sort of walk you through how you reference using the Harvard referencing system. How you reference websites or books or journals. So the university will give you that. And even if you were sort of doing a foundation course pre-university or anything like that, the centre where you're doing that will tell you that.
And I think in terms of spelling, I think that the generally it doesn't matter if you use US or UK spelling or whatever it may be. I think the advice is that the student is consistent throughout.
Sure. And I think one of those comments you made a moment ago was about I can't remember what you said, but something about whether the difference between American writing and British. I don't think it was the spelling; it was something else. But just you often US universities' essays apparently are quite direct. As well as quite formal, whereas British universities were just a lot more cautious. We use cautious language. when writing.
I see.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Okay. All right. So by combining all of these, that's sort of demonstrating critical evaluation as well as sort of your voice.
There's a little bit of
heard.
noise on your microphone, Maria. I don't know if
Is
it's
there?
your hair or clothes. It just comes and goes. Just
okay.
everywhere. Okay.
All right. Okay, so moving on, synthesizing sources. So often lots of common problems with this. So presenting your authors separately instead of collectively. So in my experience of this, students often, might use one source per paragraph.
Could we just double check what you mean by synthesizing sources, because it may be a term people aren't familiar with.
Okay, so synthesizing sources, remember I'm talking about academic writing. So students have done their research, they found their sources, and now they're starting to write their essay. So in UK universities, academic writing is all about using evidence and being able to critically evaluate that evidence and combine it. So synthesizing sources in a main body paragraph would be using 3 or 4 sources in that paragraph and being able to find similarities and differences between views in those sources and linking them together and commenting on the fact that they are similar. Okay, or they're different, or you're adding some extra information to that, as well as commenting whether you feel the source is strong, or if you were introducing a counter argument, where the weakness is in that source, why your position is stronger, etc. Does that help? Okay. So yes, relying on single source notes to construct your draft, so not having a range of sources, giving a personal opinion rather than basing your views on evidence that you've presented, presenting summarized or paraphrased statements that haven't been analysed. So, my experience, sometimes I've had student work where it's just been listed, really. I've read a paragraph and there might be a vague topic sentence in there, and then it's just source after source after source, but there's no connection between them. And that's what synthesizing is. Overgeneralizing, being too vague, and assuming casual connections without presenting evidence for them. So I suppose that goes back to what's expected of the writer's responsibility of being very clear and concise.
So there's, I think when we talked about this a few days ago, we found that in our experience, all of these things are really quite difficult for students to get their head around, and it can take them a long time, as in it's an ongoing learning process. Have you found that?
Absolutely, but I'm going to show you a tool now that you can use to make that a little bit easier. And again, it's a process. It takes a long time, but hopefully this is a way of making it a little bit easier for students to understand what you mean by synthesizing. You have to kind of demonstrate it, really. Okay, so let's have a look at that. All right, so I've got a little sort of grid here. Okay, so the student has made notes from 4 sources and identified a range of themes. The topic is assignments versus exams. So let's have a look at the first one. So here's the source, Jones et al. And the student has made some notes on assignments, exams, and some more notes on assignments. So this is one source that they've found. Let's have a look at another source. So we've got Peters. Get exams. They've made some notes here and again here. So you can see assignments with Jones, students get feedback, whereas with Peters and exams, there's no feedback. Okay, let's have a look here. So this is similar. So you've got assignments here. With Jones, learn to read and write in the study subject. Assignments, learn the discourse of the subject. So here's a similarity. Okay, so let's have a look at Wonderland University. Exams. Success relies on memory, which is the same as Peter's. That also, yes, relies on memory. So students can put these two sources together. They can link them together and comment on how their views are the same, as well as Jones and Peters when they're talking about assignments. And then they compare some differences here between Jones and Peters when they talk about assignments and exams.
What do you think is the significance of presenting the students doing this in a grid form?
Just because it's visual, isn't it? This students use different colour pens here to show similarities and differences. And it's something that they can go back to. And it, yeah, and it's just organised, isn't it? It's organised, it's visual, it's note form, you know, and it's something they can just keep going back to. So when it comes to the time where they have to write their essay, they've got this here. So they've already made links, which is fantastic. So they're synthesizing.
So that presentation is also something, if you have time in the classroom to do this, to get the students maybe to experiment with different ways of taking notes and presenting things, because that visual element can really help. I wish that I had done things in this way when I was studying at university.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've learned so much teaching this that I didn't know when I was studying.
Absolutely. And then a final one, Abbott. So here we go. Assignments are costly, expensive. Okay, so this is an additional piece of information. Don't think any of the other sources have mentioned that. Exams, clean-cut approach as you get students' knowledge under supervised circumstances. Here we go.
Okay, Maria, there's another slightly tricky point here in the chat that a few people are saying they find their students give a lot of pushback against this. They feel like it's a bit of a waste of time to make notes. They're reluctant to do it. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, well, students don't, do they? What students want to do is they just want to start writing often, don't they? They just want to crack on, start writing their essays, but actually that's when you've got the problems of they just haven't answered the question, you know, they'll receive lower marks. You know, I think if you're intending to go to university and study in an academic kind of environment, then, you know, learning a skill like this is so useful going forward. You know, it's just, and the great thing about it is it's just repeated, isn't it? It's just a process. Once you start learning the process, and then you just repeat it throughout your undergraduate, and by the end of it, you'll be writing papers, you know, who knows?
And so hopefully if students use this kind of structure, especially with the grid, different colours, these kinds of things, and they can go back and look at their notes easily afterwards, they may find that it's actually saved them a lot of time.
Yeah, well, it does,
by the end of the process, and they might look back and realise how
and I think that's the, you know, the academic writing process, you know, the actual writing the essay takes the least amount of time. It's the preparation. It's understanding the question, it's doing the reading, it's, you know, looking at the outline, it's all of that. And then by the time you've done all of that, you're ready. So writing the essay, in fact, is the least, you know, if you're supported with all these tools, then you should be able to, you know, you don't have to, depending on what the audience and what their context is, you know, you don't have to do, you know, you could just start with two sources, you know, two short texts that students can practice on, you know, but at least it's more than one. That's the thing.
Great.
Okay, lovely. So steps in synthesis. So read the text, highlight the main points. So look at the topic sentences, look at any sources that have been used in that text, any evidence, any data. make some notes using key points and ideas in your own words. Then identify common ideas. So this is when that grid comes in, you know, show the students the grid, get them to put their notes like that. And then, yeah, and then just identify similarities and differences. And then write your synthesis. Okay, make sure you cite, you reference all the authors that you've used. So that's your synthesis, and you know, and part of that as well, you know, you're going to be commenting, you're going to be using reporting verbs to show your position. You might be using intensifying adverbs and hedging, you know, all of what we spoke about earlier in terms of your position. That's all part of this sort of, you know, that all comes together, it's all combined. Okay, so finally, we're looking at using an academic tone. So academic language is usually formal, objective, impersonal. So it should be clear, concise, focused, and convincing. So I think it's really important here that you know, students and teachers ask that question around, you know, for example, using the use of I in essay writing. I've had students that have used it lots, and you know, I sort of generally say, look, you want to try and keep a distance from it, and use other language like, you know, research has shown, it's believed, and that just gives it a much more academic tone. And also using I, you know, then it all becomes a bit personal. It can slip into being a bit chatty, and so you know, you have to be a bit careful with that. And also using I, you know, it might not be very objective. You know, that's really important. So finding out what the conventions are in your subject, find out what your tutors want. Okay.
Oh, so yes, Maria,
Mhm.
there's a number of things coming up in the Q&A and the chat about different contexts. So I think, again, you're talking about sort of general UK university requirements, aren't you? But whether a thesis, whether an abstract is required, for example, or if it's a reflective essay, maybe the students would use more I think all of these things just depend, don't they, on what the students are being asked to do.
I think that's why it's important. That's why it's important for students to find out what the conventions are in their subject, you know, because there might be a case where they have to use I, and, you know, but it's up to them to find out what that is.
Right. So it's not like this is like the way to do it. It all depends. I think what you're saying is, yeah, students need to be aware, and maybe the onus is on them to make sure they know what's required for each assignment they've got.
Yes. But in this context, you might have students that are coming over to the UK to study. I'm not sure, you might follow the same UK sort of system in your country, I don't know, but this is kind of what's expected at a British university. So I'm sure that'll be quite kind of useful for so in terms of academic tone, you know, avoid using rhetorical questions, avoid being too personal with I, avoid contracted verbs, write in full, avoid emotive or informal adjectives, avoid using and or but to begin sentences. So, you know, going back to the slide where we looked at, you know, showing your position throughout your essay, using reporting verbs, adding a comment, intensifying adverbs, all that, by using all of that in an essay will give it an academic tone, you know. Okay, so are there any other questions?
There's something that came up in the chat a little bit earlier, which was to do with paraphrasing. Students find it very difficult to paraphrase.
Yeah.
And I was just aware that there was some discussion around synonyms, and I found students can overuse synonyms and very easily change the meaning, and that actually it's maybe better to focus on different forms of the same word. So if we're talking about academic language, maybe looking at nouns, adjectives, those forms of a verb. So you're paraphrasing by
changing the word class.
Yes.
Rather than, there's different ways of paraphrasing, isn't there? And I think that's important that you've mentioned that, because part of sort of criticality in academic writing, in the context that I'm in, is, being able to paraphrase and summarize skillfully, being able to do that. So I haven't talked about that today, but that's really, really important. And yes, using synonyms, but also not relying on that, like Lucy said, changing the word class, changing the word order, restructuring the sentence.
So maybe from an active to a passive sentence, for example.
Or just combine, all of them. I find it really useful in my classes when I'm focusing on paraphrasing, give them a sentence, and then I might say, okay, so underline maybe 3 or 4 words. Okay, so I want you to rewrite the sentence, but use synonyms for those 3 or 4 words. And then I might say, okay, the same sentence, but now I want you to change the word class of those 3 or 4 words. And then the next task, okay, now you need to change the word order, the structure.
Oh, great. So you're showing them different ways of doing the same sentence.
Of doing the same thing, and they find that really useful.
Yeah, because I think that this overuse of synonyms, you can end up with some quite bizarre and quite hilarious sentences sometimes. I've seen people, instead of using the word people, they've used things like Homo sapiens, and that's fine if you're writing about anthropology, but it's quite strange in most complex contexts. So they can make a little web for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Are there any other questions anybody want to ask me?
Just having a look here in the Q&A, what's come up.
I might just put that reference list so people can. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I just want to. Will I review it, or will I wait for?
Oh, actually, there's just a few more things in the Q&A worth mentioning. Okay. I think there's quite specific questions though, so I think it all depends again on what the essay question is and what students are being asked to do. There's things like, should the writer support the same point of view throughout, or is it better to present 2 different points of view in the body? It kind of depends what the question's asking you to do, right?
Yeah, but I suppose in an academic essay, your position has to be supported throughout. So I would definitely, have the same position throughout, so there's a sense of progression, isn't there? But show a counter argument, show the other view, but obviously show that your evidence and research refutes that, that it's stronger than that.
Right. So one of the questions is about whether you should give your point of view in the conclusion, but of course you said that you need to address it in the introduction. Why is that then?
I think, well, you're informing the reader of what they're about to read, isn't it? So they have a look at the introduction, they've got the context, you've got your position, and you've outlined the argument, which is what the essay is going to be about. So you've got to support that argument with your position throughout the essay. Don't wait to the end. It's the onus is on you to inform the reader. It's your responsibility to be clear and to
Great. Yeah.
But that's one of the conventions here, isn't it? That's the style. Your thesis is at the beginning. Maybe in other countries it's at the end. Maybe because I've had students that do that give, state the position at the end in their conclusion. Whereas it's really important to put it at the beginning so the reader knows exactly where you stand.
So understanding the conventions of within the context that you're writing is the starting point.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, great, thanks, Maria.
Okay, so just to quickly review, so make sure, like we just talked about, your students are aware of the geolinguistics context they're writing in. Read lots, You know, this gives students an idea of conventions and style. There's patterns, isn't there? The academic writing process is a process. It takes time. So, you know, don't expect sort of miracles, you know, small steps, really. Just breaking it down, Know that your position might change as you widen your reading. So like myself and Lucy said at the beginning of the presentation, that yes, students might be forming an opinion when they have a look at their question, but that might change as they start doing their research. I think it's really important that I am talking about academic writing in universities here. It's not like, yeah. Cover lots of practice in lessons. So cover lots of practice on, you know, reporting verbs, breaking down the question, formal, informal language. So lots of comparing. This is a really good website. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it. I love it. But it's got some really useful exercises in here and videos. So I don't know if you want to take a photo of that. Or... Okay.
So Maria, I think, sorry, just to go back to the previous slide.
Yeah.
So I think that you've put the word process in capital letters. Could you just talk a little bit more about how it's a process? How long does it take for students to get their heads around this?
Well, I mean, if I think about my context, you know, presently I'm teaching academic development to undergraduate British students, and you know, that's a year course. You know, and I also teach international students, and that's also, that can be 2 or 3 terms, you know, before they transition to university.
And do you feel that by the end of that course, that's it? They're doing all of these perfectly?
The whole thing is that they've got an understanding of what it is, you know, and as they develop, once they get to university and they start their degrees, that obviously will, you know, they'll get much better at that, and they'll have grasped it. But you know, this is just the beginning, and it's just I mean, even British students, I mean, I'm sure you, Lucy, when I went to university, I mean, you know, I would have loved to sort of have this, you know, not everybody does, do they? At the beginning of university life. And yeah, so it is a process and it does take time, but as long as they're introduced to it and they're aware of it, that it's a style.
Right. So do you think, sorry, Maria.
Yeah, cool.
Do you think it's analogous to learning to drive, that you have all these driving lessons and it can take quite a while, but really it's when you've passed your test and you're on the road and you experience these things that you develop that true understanding of it? So it's probably that we're teaching our students, lining everything up, but then they'll really be honing their skills throughout their course.
Yeah. But my experience of my students, both British and international, have been really positive, you know, on the course. You know, some of them are totally grasp it and they've produced great work. Others, you know, they've still got work to do, but they're on track, you know. So it's just introducing this to them, you know, and getting them to understand that there is a structure to this that you've got to follow.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the challenges that teachers find, such as some people have mentioned in the chat, it's really hard to get their students to read. They're not avid readers. Oh, well, we face that. But when they're doing their course, that's what they're going to be reading papers.
They have to. Yeah, they have to.
I think
that's it, isn't it? You have to do it. Yeah. But this, you know, I mean, reading skills, that's another webinar, isn't it? Of ways of sort of making that a little bit more accessible and easier for students. That's another thing, isn't it? Because that's also a process. But yeah, so hopefully it's been useful.
Right, and you've got some links.
Yeah, so I've just so research synthesis, this is a really useful video here, and hopefully you'll all be able to access it. And again, the small synthesis here. Oh yes, the Manchester Academic Phrase Bank. It's a bit of a lifesaver, this. So focuses on lots of reporting verbs, combining sources, lots of cohesive devices. So really, really useful for students for academic writing. And then this was my initial slide of finding your voice and thinking about your geolinguistic context. This is a short video, but again, you know, pretty useful. It's just about awareness, really, I think.
Great. So when you finish, Maria, I'm going to share a slide again that just repeats the place that everybody can find this recording. So all of the recordings basically of the webinars are on the same pages where you went to register. So new upcoming webinars and previous ones are all on the same page, but I will put that link up again. So the recording will be available, but not your original slides. So people won't be able to unfortunately click on these links, but you'll be able to see them in the recording and then copy them. Type them out and hopefully access all of these things. So yeah, they look really, really useful, Maria. Great. So that's a little bit of a sort of whistle-stop tour, isn't it? Because there's so much here. And I think from a lot of the questions and the comments in the chat, it seems people have so many questions about whether they should do this or do that, and specific questions. But I think it probably just depends so much on the university, the department, the particular essay question they're being asked. So maybe it's just about, as a teacher, having that understanding that all of these things can come into play.
And even if you're not teaching students that are going to university, or you can still teach them, you know, breaking down the essay question. You can still, you know, encourage them to use different critical language in their essays, you know, without, because I know, you know, some sort of other levels, or depending on the context, they might not be doing lots of research and using sources and things like that. But that doesn't mean you can't use cautious language, or you can't try to integrate that into it a little bit, or maybe in your classes, you know, introduce a text, or get students to start referring to sources and thinking about it.
Great, great. Okay, I think that's everything. Later on in the year, in the autumn, we're going to have a webinar about more specifically focusing on critical thinking, especially for teenagers and young learners. So the details of that will be coming up on the website soon. So hopefully you'll join us for that.